Welcome, dear friends. I'm so glad you've joined us tonight. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? It's always a joy to see how far these mysteries travel. And a gentle reminder, over 80% of our listeners haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy these daily mysteries, don't miss the next one. Now settle in, blanket, tea, and a quiet place. Because tonight's story begins with something most peculiar. A simple card. A card that should never have arrived. And by the end, you'll see how one message buried a household in suspicion. The morning was quiet in Street Mary Mead. Mist clung low to the hedgerows. At Gossington Hall, the day began as it always did. Dolly Bantry sat at the breakfast table. Her silver hair was pinned neatly. Letters lay spread beside her plate, toast, marmalade, and strong tea her usual. James, the butler, entered with measured steps. He placed a rack of fresh toast down. "Cook says the marmalade is especially fine this morning, madam." Dolly glanced up, amused. "Cook always says that, James." Her tone was light, but her eyes remained sharp, scanning envelopes. Years of committee work made her precise. Colonel Arthur Bantry entered a moment later, still upright, still military, though past 60. He kissed his wife on the cheek. "Morning, my dear. Anything of interest today?" "Mostly committee papers," Dolly replied, opening one. "Hospital fund again. Harriet Pike wants accounts balanced to the penny, as if I ever misplace a shilling." The colonel chuckled, reaching for the teapot. James lingered, his composure flickering. "There is one unusual item this morning, madam." Dolly raised an eyebrow. "Unusual? From whom?" James hesitated. "It appears to be a condolence card." He produced a black-edged envelope, laying it on a silver tray. Dolly frowned. "A condolence card? For me?" She opened it briskly. Inside, bold print read, "In deepest sympathy for your loss." And below, in another hand, "So sudden, so cruel." For a moment, silence hung. Then Dolly laughed, bright and incredulous. "How perfectly absurd. Someone thinks I'm dead." Arthur leaned forward, inspecting the card. Local postmark. Typed address. Expensive paper. "Curious business," he muttered. "Surely it's just a mistake," Dolly said. "Some muddle at the printer's, perhaps, or the post office." She slipped the card into her pocket, brushing it aside. But James lingered still. "Madam, with respect, mistakes rarely come with such detail." The colonel snorted, forcing cheer. "Dramatic nonsense, sudden and cruel indeed. Some silly joke." At that moment, voices echoed in the hall. The first visitors of the day. Mrs. Harriet Pike, brisk and severe, and Veronica Denham, Dolly's fashionable cousin from London. They entered with contrasting energy. Harriet with her portfolio, Veronica with perfume and warmth. "Dolly, darling," Veronica exclaimed, "how divine to see you looking so well." The breakfast scene shifted to chatter, to accounts, to family gossip. But on the sideboard, the black-edged card lay waiting. Unopened letters beside it, an object out of place in the rhythm of the morning. And Miss Marple, arriving moments later with a knitted comforter, let her eyes rest on it. Quietly, curiously, as if she already knew. It was no mistake. The morning drifted on. Routine, familiar, safe. Mrs. Pike spread her papers across the table. Figures, ledgers, hospital accounts, all laid out with meticulous care. She tapped each column with a fountain pen, lips pursed. Dolly listened, nodding. "Harriet, dear, you make it sound as if the hospital fund were a battlefield. Surely a penny missing here or there won't bring it to ruin." Mrs. Pike sniffed. "Order is order, Mrs. Bantry. It is our duty." Her voice was firm, almost clipped. Veronica Denham leaned back with a laugh. "Oh, Harriet, you do take things so seriously. Dolly has been managing committees longer than either of us. If she says all is well, then surely it is." Her London accent cut through the country, calm, light, and effortless. She stirred her tea idly, bracelets clinking, but her eyes flicked once quickly toward the black-edged card still lying near Dolly's plate, a glance too quick, but not unnoticed. James returned with more cups, setting them down with perfect precision. His expression was unreadable, but he, too, glanced at the card. The ordinary breakfast suddenly had an intruder in its midst. Everyone pretended not to see it, yet no one could quite ignore it. "Do try the marmalade, Veronica," Dolly said cheerfully, as if to shift the mood. "Cook insists it's her best batch this year." Veronica obliged, spreading a neat layer on her toast. She smiled, but her bite was delicate, hesitant. "Delicious," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. Mrs. Pike reached instead for plain butter. "Too sweet for me," she muttered. Dolly's hand hovered over the pot. She paused, then withdrew, almost unconsciously. Her smile faded for just a moment before she recovered. "Perhaps I'll wait until Elevenses," she said briskly. The room continued as though nothing were wrong. Tea poured, numbers read aloud. Veronica gossiped about London society. Arthur Bantry wandered in and out, offering remarks about the vicar and his endless sermons. All perfectly ordinary. Almost too ordinary. Miss Marple, seated quietly by the window with her knitting, observed without interruption. She smiled, nodded, asked no questions, but her eyes never left the marmalade jar, or the card, or the way Dolly Bantry had hesitated. Conversation rolled on like any other morning at Gossington Hall. Harriet complained of ledgers. Veronica praised her cousin's resilience. James polished the silver teapot for the second time in 10 minutes. And Dolly, composed as always, pretended she wasn't troubled. All of it normal, almost rehearsed, almost staged. And then the silence was broken. The clock struck 11. The ritual of Elevenses was in motion. James entered with the tea trolley, silver polished, cups gleaming, seed cakes neatly arranged. The smell of orange marmalade hung faintly in the air. Colonel Bantry had returned from his morning visit to Dr. Haydock, cheerful, brisk, voice carrying that military snap. "Doctor says the mayor's fit as ever. Nonsense about illness." He poured himself tea, content. Dolly smiled. "Arthur, doctors fuss too much. You know that." She reached for the toast rack. Her hand, steady as ever, lifted a slice. She spread marmalade. Amber light caught the surface of the preserve. Routine, familiar, harmless. The first bite was taken without thought, and then everything changed. Her smile faltered. Her hand went to her throat. Her color drained from pink to ashen gray. "I say," she gasped, "I feel most peculiar." The room froze. Colonel Bantry leapt to his feet. "Dolly!" He caught her as she slumped, half falling from the chair. James stood rigid, then moved with sudden urgency. "I'll fetch the doctor." Miss Marple was already at the telephone in the hall, her voice calm, precise. "Urgent. Dr. Haydock, at once. Collapse at Gossington Hall. Back in the room. Chaos." Veronica clutched a napkin, pale, trembling. Mrs. Pike pressed both hands to her mouth. Arthur knelt, feeling for a pulse. Faint. Weak. "Oh, God." Miss Marple returned, composed. Eyes sharp. "Flat, Colonel. Raise her feet. James brandy." Her instructions were soft, firm, unquestioned. Dolly's breathing was ragged, shallow. Her lips moved, whispering. No one caught the words. Moments dragged. Veronica wept openly now. Mrs. Pike hovered, frozen in her severity. James reappeared with brandy, hands shaking. Arthur tried to steady his wife's head, voice breaking. "Stay with us, Dolly, please." The sound of wheels on gravel. The ambulance arrived. Dr. Haydock himself rushed in, bag open, face grave. He knelt, checked pulse, pupils, skin. His frown deepened. Poisoning symptoms. She must be moved immediately. The word hung like a stone in the air. Poison. Arthur's face went white. Veronica gasped. Mrs. Pike sat heavily, eyes wide. James froze, whispering, "Poison? From what? From where?" No one answered, but Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the marmalade jar on the sideboard. She stepped closer, lifted it delicately, inhaled, thoughtful, quiet. Her expression tightened, though she said nothing. Colonel Bantry accompanied the stretcher, face carved in anguish. The ambulance doors slammed shut. Its siren wailed into the distance. The hall fell silent again, except for the sound of Veronica's sobbing, and Mrs. Pike whispering to no one in particular, "It must be some mistake, a dreadful mistake." Miss Marple set the marmalade down with infinite care. Her eyes lingered on the black-edged card beside Dolly's plate. Her voice, low, almost to herself. Surely it was a mistake. Or was it? The ambulance had gone. Gossington Hall stood in uneasy quiet, the air heavy, unnatural, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Miss Marple remained. She had declined to follow the others to the hospital. Instead, she moved quietly through the breakfast room, her knitting bag on the chair, her eyes sharper than anyone guessed. James lingered at the door. His voice was low, shaken. "Inspector Slack will be here soon, Miss Marple." "Yes," she said softly, lifting the marmalade jar again. Her fingers turned it with delicate care. Like porcelain. The doctor was right. Poison. But the question, James, why only Mrs. Bantry? He swallowed. No one else touched it. A pause. Madam's habit. Marmalade every morning. No one else. Miss Marple nodded, eyes narrowing. She examined the rim. Sticky. Darker than the center. She scraped it with a teaspoon. Tasted carefully. Lips pressing together. Her expression thoughtful, not surprised. "Very interesting," she murmured. "Quite bitter. Not part of cook's recipe." Veronica returned then, eyes red, handkerchief crushed in her palm. She dropped into a chair. "This is ghastly, utterly ghastly." Miss Marple's gaze rested on her, gentle yet probing. "You seemed reluctant, my dear, when Mrs. Bantry urged you to try the marmalade earlier. Did you taste something unusual?" Veronica looked startled. "Oh, no. No. It was fine. Perfectly fine." Her voice fluttered, uncertain. Mrs. Pike reappeared, clutching her portfolio. She tried for composure but failed. "We mustn't leap to conclusions. Surely it was food poisoning. These things happen." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on her, then drifted to the card still lying on the table, the black border, the careful script, the typewritten address. She lifted it, held it up against the light from the window. Good quality paper. Expensive. The kind not purchased casually. Arthur Bantry entered at that moment, face haggard. "Haydock says it looks very bad. He fears the worst." His voice cracked. "I can't believe it. Dolly, my Dolly." Miss Marple placed the card gently back on the table. Her voice, calm as always, almost tender. "Colonel, sometimes mistakes tell us more than truths." Arthur blinked at her, not understanding. Veronica stared. Mrs. Pike bristled, and James, listening from the doorway, shivered. Because the way Miss Marple spoke, it didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like certainty. She settled into her chair again, drawing her knitting into her lap. Her needles clicked softly, rhythm steady, as though nothing at all had disturbed her. But her eyes never left the marmalade jar, nor the black-edged card, nor the faces of those in the room, and her words hung in the air like a riddle. "Mistakes, my dear, often reveal more than truths." Inspector Slack arrived that afternoon, his heavy steps, his brisk tone, his notebook snapping open like a weapon. No patience for grief, no patience for comfort. He questioned James first. The butler stood stiff, hands folded, face pale. His voice held steady, but each answer trembled just enough to show strain. "You served the toast? You poured the tea?" Slack pressed. "Yes, Inspector, as I have done every morning for 30 years. "And the marmalade?" Who set it out? James hesitated. His pause was long. Too long. Cook prepared the jar. I placed it on the table. Slack's pen scratched. You touched it? James stiffened. Yes, Inspector. I touched it. But no more than any servant would. Miss Marple, seated quietly by the window, looked up from her knitting. Her voice was mild. James, do you recall which jar was opened this morning? I understand Mrs. Bantry preferred the crystal one. Yes, Miss Marple, always the crystal. It was already half full. I set it out myself. Slack leaned closer. And you saw no one tamper with it? James shifted. His eyes flicked away. He swallowed hard. No, Inspector. No one. Veronica, watching from across the room, spoke suddenly, her tone sharp. I saw him linger by the sideboard yesterday, before breakfast. James turned, startled. That is not true, Miss Denham. I was merely polishing the silver. Polishing the silver at dawn? Veronica's eyebrow arched. Unusual, isn't it? Slack's gaze hardened. Well, plenty of opportunity. James's composure cracked. His hands shook now, his voice unsteady. Madam trusted me. I would never harm her. Silence, heavy, accusing. Mrs. Pike broke it, her voice crisp. Inspector, surely the man should be dismissed at once. Such behavior is highly irregular. James looked stricken. Color drained from his face. I loved this house. I served faithfully. I swear I am innocent. Slack snapped his notebook shut. Maybe not, but you had the chance. And chance, James, is often enough. The butler's hands gripped the back of a chair, knuckles white. His eyes dropped to the floor. Guilt or fear hung around him like a shadow. Miss Marple's needles clicked. She spoke softly, almost to herself. Opportunity, yes. But motive? That is quite another matter. Slack turned sharply. You think he's innocent, Miss Marple? Her eyes lifted, blue and sharp. I think mistakes are often made when one looks only at opportunity. True guilt hides itself more carefully. She glanced at the condolence card lying on the sideboard. Her voice dropped lower. Unless, of course, they knew exactly when sympathy would be needed. Inspector Slack was far from done. James had shaken under questioning, but suspicion was not finished with the servants. Attention turned now toward Harriet Pike. She sat straight-backed, her portfolio clutched like armor, her lips pressed into a firm line as Slack approached. Mrs. Pike, he began, you've been closely involved with Mrs. Bantry's committee work, the hospital fund, in particular. Her chin lifted. I have, Inspector, and I have always conducted myself with integrity. Slack flipped a page in his notebook. Interesting, because according to these figures, there are irregularities, missing entries, numbers that don't balance. A pause. Harriet's fingers tightened on the leather strap of her portfolio. Clerical errors, she said firmly. Nothing more. Veronica laughed lightly from her chair. Oh, Harriet, you and your errors. Dolly said herself you worry too much. She never misplaced a penny, yet you pore over columns as if you'd find gold. The jab stung. Harriet flushed. Dolly questioned me more than once about the accounts. She was beginning to mistrust the system. She said as much. Miss Marple's eyes lifted at that. A small note tucked away in her mind. Slack leaned closer. So Dolly was pressing you, asking questions, perhaps becoming inconvenient. Harriet bristled. How dare you suggest such a thing? I respected her. I devoted myself to that fund, and benefited from it, Veronica murmured, her tone sharp now. Her bracelets clinked as she leaned forward. You always had access, Harriet. Always at the desk. Always with the ledgers. I think you liked having control. Harriet's eyes narrowed. And I suppose you're above suspicion, Veronica. Floating about from London, never lifting a finger, yet always near when money or influence was at hand. The two women locked eyes. Tension thickened in the air. Arthur Bantry shifted uncomfortably, his face drawn. Slack watched, his jaw tight. Interesting. Very interesting. One with access, another with family ties, both near the scene, both with reasons. Harriet straightened, her tone icy. I have nothing to hide. If mistakes were made in the books, they were innocent, nothing more. Veronica smirked. Innocent mistakes often hide guilty hands. Silence settled. Even the tick of the clock seemed loud. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. She looked between the two women, Harriet with her precision, Veronica with her charm, and saw the clash for what it was. Not just bickering, not just rivalry, but something deeper, something that smelled of ambition and gain. Her voice, soft, almost lost in the quiet. Between them, ladies and gentlemen, one of them had everything to gain. By the next morning, the village was humming. Word of Dolly Bantry's sudden collapse had flown faster than the Morning Post. Every corner of Street Mary Mead seemed alive with whispers. At the High Street grocer's, Mrs. Price leaned over the counter. So sudden, they say. Poisoning. Imagine. And at Gossington Hall, of all places. Her voice dropped lower. I heard she had a condolence card before it even happened. Behind her, old Mr. Sims chimed in, his cap in his hands. Superstitious nonsense, I say. But cards don't post themselves, do they? At the churchyard gate, two women bent their heads together, voices sharp as sparrows. Harriet Pike was seen storming away from the hall, red as a beet. And Veronica laughing the very next hour, heartless, that one. Gossip clung to both women like ivy on stone. Money, reputation, old grudges all tangled in whispers. At the pub that evening, voices grew bolder. They say the marmalade was tampered with. A jar. In Dolly's house. Only someone close could do that. And what about James? 30 years a butler. But 30 years is long enough to learn every secret. Even the vicar's wife, usually mild, was overheard at the flower shop. I shall send a wreath, but there's confusion already. Orders have doubled, and I'm told 2 wreaths arrived yesterday, both with Dolly's name upon them. The florist herself frowned, trimming stems with neat precision. Yes, 2 wreaths indeed. Same handwriting on both cards. Quite impossible, unless... She trailed off, unwilling to finish. Miss Marple heard all of it. In the shop. At the church. On the lane where whispers chased her footsteps. She did not join in. She listened, every word tucked neatly away. That evening, she visited the hall. Colonel Bantry was weary, his eyes hollow from hours at the hospital. She rests poorly. Haydock fears the worst. The villagers chatter like hens. God help us, Jane. Dolly deserves better. Miss Marple's hand rested lightly on his. Chatter, Arthur, is rarely without some kernel of truth. The trick is knowing which kernel to plant. She asked to see the wreaths. James led her to the side parlour, where flowers crowded the air with heavy scent. 2 wreaths sat side by side, white lilies, white roses, both identical. Miss Marple bent low, 2 cards tucked among the blooms. Each said, in deepest sympathy. Each signed, with love and regret. And both, without doubt, written in the same hand. Her voice, quiet, steady, carried through the silent room. But why 2 wreaths signed by the same hand? The funeral came too soon. Barely 3 days after Dolly Bantry's collapse, the notices were printed, the ceremony arranged, and the undertaker's carriage rolled to the churchyard. Too soon, Miss Marple thought. Too neat. The service was brief. The coffin, polished oak with brass handles, was already sealed when it arrived. No one had viewed the body. Dr. Haydock had spoken of delicate circumstances and respecting dignity. Excuses, vague and unsatisfying. Colonel Bantry stood tall beside the casket, his grief carved into lines of stone. He shook hands, accepted murmured sympathies, nodded stiffly. Every movement was disciplined, controlled, as though military drill were keeping him upright. Veronica wore black silk, a veil shading her face. She dabbed her eyes often, though the tears seemed to come and go with curious timing. Whispers followed her. So close to Dolly. Too close, some say. Harriet Pike arrived with her ledger tucked under her arm, even at a funeral. She knelt with rigid formality, lips pressed together. Her prayers, like her figures, exact and cold. More whispers. She'll take over the hospital fund now. Perhaps that's what she wanted all along. The villagers filled the pews, whispering behind hymn books. James stood with the staff, pale and drawn, eyes fixed on the coffin as though it were accusing him directly. The vicar's words were gentle, practiced. He spoke of Dolly's generosity and unwavering duty. He spoke of her role in the community. He spoke of the fragility of life. But Miss Marple heard something else. The speed of the arrangements, the lack of detail, the way every step seemed prepared in advance, as if someone had written the script before the curtain had risen. When the final hymn ended, the coffin was borne out, carried smoothly, without hesitation. The crowd followed, murmuring prayers, offering condolences, bowing their heads. The graveside words were short. Earth was scattered, flowers laid, too fast, too perfect. Not a slip, not a stumble, every movement rehearsed. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes fixed on the closed lid. Not once had anyone confirmed Dolly Bantry's body within. Not once had the village been allowed to see her face, pale and still. She pressed her lips together, thoughtful. She whispered softly, almost as though to herself, "Grief is never so neat." As the crowd began to drift away, she remained, her gaze on the earth piled too evenly, the service wrapped too tightly, and in the quiet she let the thought escape, sharp as a pin, unless, of course, there was no body at all. The morning after the funeral, Miss Marple walked to Gossington Hall. The colonel had gone to the solicitor. The house felt hollow, its silence deep as the grave. James greeted her stiffly, his uniform pressed, though his eyes were rimmed red. "Miss Marple, I don't know what will become of us. Without Madam—" He stopped, throat tightening. She patted his arm gently. "Grief takes many shapes, James. Sometimes it drives us to tidiness too quickly." He blinked, not understanding, but led her into the study. Papers lay scattered on the desk. Committee minutes, hospital fund accounts, receipts. Miss Marple's hand brushed over them, pausing at one sheet. A ledger page, copied out neatly in Harriet Pike's strict handwriting. Too neat. Not a blot, not a smudge, as though rewritten. "James," she said softly, "have these always been here?" "No, miss. They were delivered this morning. Mrs. Pike asked me to see they reached the colonel." Miss Marple's eyes lingered. The ink still smelled sharp. Fresh. Too fresh. She folded the paper back into the stack, her fingers light. On the sideboard, the marmalade jar still Saturday uncleared, unused. She lifted it once more. Inside, the preserve had darkened. Grainy residue clung to the rim. She touched it with her knitting needle, brought it close. The smell was bitter, acrid, deadly. Veronica entered just then, her black veil pushed back, perfume trailing. "Oh, Miss Marple, how ghastly this all is. But surely, now the funeral is past, things will return to order?" Miss Marple looked up at her, mild. "Order, my dear, is often the thing criminals strive hardest to create. But order can be a mask." Veronica forced a smile. "Always so mysterious, Aunt Jane. Sometimes I think you rather enjoy all this." Miss Marple returned her gaze to the jar. Her voice was calm, almost conversational. "Enjoyment? No. Observation? Yes. And observation tells me this marmalade did not sit here by chance, nor were these ledgers rewritten by accident." Veronica's smile faltered. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple set the jar down, precise, deliberate. Her words were soft, but the weight of them filled the room. This was no accident, it was rehearsed. Inspector Slack was not a patient man, but even he agreed with Miss Marple's quiet suggestion. Someone should keep watch at Gossington Hall. So that night, the hall did not sleep alone. Slack posted himself in the library, his notebook open, revolver heavy in his pocket. Constable Bell crouched near the side entrance, out of sight, and in the small parlour, knitting in her lap, Miss Marple waited. The clock ticked past midnight. Wind rattled the panes. The house creaked, old timbers shifting like bones in the dark. For a long while, nothing stirred. Only silence. Only waiting. Then, a faint scrape, soft, deliberate. At the study door, Slack's head lifted. He moved like a cat, slow, soundless. Miss Marple's needles stilled in mid-air. Her eyes shone in the lamplight. The door creaked open. A shadow slipped inside. Slim, cloaked, cautious. A figure bent over the desk. The faint glint of metal. A key slid into the lock of the colonel's cabinet. A drawer opened. Papers rustled. Slack surged forward. "Hold it right there." The figure gasped, turning sharply. Harriet Pike, her eyes wide, hands clutching a bundle of ledgers. Slack grabbed her arm. "What do you call this?" I came to protect them," Harriet stammered. Colonel Bantry left them unsecured. Anyone might tamper with them. Slack sneered. "Unsecured? In a locked drawer?" He yanked the papers from her grip. Fresh pages. Clean ink. Too clean. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her knitting left behind. She moved closer, her voice low but steady. "Mrs. Pike, you have been at the heart of those accounts for years, always guarding, always correcting. Tell me, why copy them out anew, in the dead of night?" Harriet flushed, her voice trembling. "I wanted to ensure nothing was misinterpreted. That's all." Slack slammed the ledger onto the desk. "These are no corrections. This is rewriting." Harriet's lips thinned. "I will not be accused like a common thief. My only aim was to preserve order." Miss Marple studied her, expression unreadable. "Order, perhaps, but sometimes order conceals a very different truth." The silence pressed tight. Harriet's hands shook, her eyes darting toward the door. She looked trapped, cornered. Slack muttered, "Stealing evidence. That's what it is." Miss Marple. Softer. Sharper. "No, Inspector. Not stealing. Look closely." She wasn't taking these papers away at all. Her gaze fixed on Harriet, piercing. She was replacing them. The words hung, heavy as iron, and Miss Marple's needles clicked once more as she whispered, "But she wasn't just stealing, she was rewriting the past." Inspector Slack wasted no time. Harriet Pike, still clutching her ledgers, was marched into the library. Constable Bell stood guard at the door. Slack slapped the papers onto the desk, caught red-handed, copying accounts in the dead of night. "Explain yourself." Harriet's face was pale, but her voice was steady. "I wasn't stealing, Inspector. I was correcting. There were errors." Slack barked a laugh. "Errors? Whole pages rewritten? Figures shifted from one column to the next? Those aren't mistakes, Mrs. Pike. That's fraud." Her hands tightened on her portfolio. "I only borrowed. Money moves quickly in these funds. A loan here, a loan there. I always intended to return it." Slack leaned closer, his voice sharp. "And when Dolly Bantry began asking questions? What then?" Harriet's composure cracked. "She confronted me, yes. She said she suspected something. She said she would bring it up at the next meeting." Her eyes darted toward Miss Marple. "I couldn't let her ruin me, not after all I've given to this village." Silence stretched. Slack's pen hovered. "So you poisoned her?" Harriet's head snapped up, eyes wide. "No, I never meant to kill her, only to make her unwell. Enough that she would withdraw from the committees, enough to keep her quiet." Her voice faltered, lower now. "I mixed the leaves myself. Foxglove. Old remedies can sicken, But I never thought they would go so far. There it is, a confession, clear as daylight. Constable Bell shifted by the door, muttering, "Case closed," then. But Miss Marple said nothing. Her needles clicked softly in her lap. Her eyes rested on Harriet, then drifted to the condolence card still lying on the side table. Her lips pressed together, as though weighing something. Harriet's words spilled faster now. "I swear to you, I never wished her dead. It was a mistake, a dreadful mistake. I only wanted her silence." Slack nodded grimly. "Motive, means, confession. That's enough for me." He gestured to Bell. "Take her in." The constable stepped forward. Harriet's shoulders sagged. Her portfolio slipped from her hands, papers scattering like fallen leaves. Miss Marple leaned forward then, her voice soft, almost regretful. "Inspector, you may have a confession, but what you do not have is the whole truth." Slack scowled. "Come now, Miss Marple." She admitted it herself. Marple's gaze lingered on the scattered papers, then returned to Harriet. "Yes," she admitted to fraud, and to poisoning, in part. But if you listen carefully, she never admitted to death. The room fell silent. Slack frowned. "What are you saying?" Miss Marple's voice was steady, her eyes unblinking. "I am saying this, Inspector." She looked down at the black-edged card, her finger resting on the typed words. "Unless the victim was never meant to die at all." News of Harriet Pike's arrest spread faster than any sermon. By the next morning, Street Mary Mead was alive with chatter. At the post office, Mrs. Price leaned across the counter, voice lowered but eager. "They say she confessed. Poisoning and all. Always did think she was too proud of those ledgers." "Old Mr." Sims shook his head, cap twisting in his hands. "Harriet Pike? She's as stiff as starch, but a poisoner? I don't believe it. Fraud, maybe. But murder?" At the grocer's, voices argued over cabbages and sugar rations. Well, she was jealous of Dolly Bantry, wasn't she? Always wanting to run the committees. Jealousy isn't murder. She's too practical for that. At the pub, louder words rang out. Serves her right, all those years bossing folk about. She thought she was untouchable, but poison in the marmalade? Too clever by half. Others shook their heads. Too clever, or too obvious? Poison's a woman's weapon, they say, but Harriet never struck me as reckless. She liked figures, not risks. By Sunday, even the vicar's sermon carried a shadow. He spoke of temptation, of the dangers of pride, of how sin revealed itself in unexpected places, and the congregation murmured, eyes flicking toward Harriet's empty pew. Yet beneath the chatter ran doubt. The village wanted the story neat, but neatness rarely sat comfortably on real life. At Gossington Hall, Inspector Slack allowed himself a rare smile. One case wrapped, Miss Marple. Clear motive, clear confession. The villagers can rest easy. But Miss Marple did not smile. She sat in the drawing-room, knitting resting on her lap, eyes far away. Her voice was gentle. Confessions, Inspector, can be convenient, sometimes too convenient. Slack frowned. You think she lied? She admitted everything. Miss Marple shook her head softly. She admitted what was safe to admit. The embezzlement. Yes. The foxglove leaves, perhaps. But notice, Inspector, her words never crossed the line into death. She spoke of illness, of silence, of inconvenience. Slack snorted. Splitting hairs. She poisoned Mrs. Bantry. Mrs. Bantry died. End of story. Miss Marple's eyes fell to the condolence card still pinned to her memory. Typed. Precise. Posted before the collapse. And the 2 wreaths, signed by the same hand, before the funeral. Her needles clicked once more, steady, deliberate. End of story, Inspector. No. Stories never end so neatly. And this one, her gaze lifted, clear and sharp as glass. Too many details remain out of place. It was late afternoon when James appeared at Miss Marple's cottage. his hat in his hands, his voice low, uncertain. "Miss Marple, something has been returned, and I thought you would want to see it first." From beneath his coat, he produced a small package, brown paper tied with string. The handwriting on the label was neat, too neat, and the address, Colonel Bantry, Gossington Hall. Miss Marple untied the string carefully. Inside lay a china teacup, Dolly Bantry's own, with its painted violets, chipped at the rim. James's voice shook. "I cleared the table myself that morning. The cup was gone. I thought perhaps the doctor or the inspector had taken it for testing, but now it arrives by post, without explanation." Miss Marple examined it. The glaze was clean, too clean. The faint trace of marmalade at the rim had been scrubbed away. She turned it over in her hands, eyes narrowing. "No return address?" "None, miss." She placed the cup on her table, beside her knitting basket. A clue returned was not a kindness, it was a message. That evening, Inspector Slack arrived, summoned at once. He frowned when he saw the cup. Some crank. The thing was useless anyway. Nothing left on it now. Miss Marple's gaze held steady. "On the contrary, Inspector, its very return tells us something vital. Someone wanted to erase evidence, and someone wanted us to know they had the power to do it." Slack grumbled, unconvinced. "A guilty conscience, that's all." But Miss Marple's thoughts moved further. The condolence card sent before Dolly's collapse, the double wreaths signed by the same hand, the cup removed, then returned, all actions prepared before death or after, if death had never come. She rose, her knitting left behind. Her voice dropped, firm and clear. "Inspector, what if Mrs. Bantry never died at all?" Slack's jaw dropped. "Never died? But there was a coffin. A funeral. A sealed coffin," Miss Marple corrected. "No one saw her body. No one except Dr. Haydock." And his words were curiously vague. The villagers were told of dignity, of respect. But dignity is also a curtain, and behind curtains anything may be concealed. Slack stared at her, his face hardening. "You're suggesting the funeral was a sham?" Miss Marple's eyes returned to the teacup, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Her voice was soft, but it pierced the air like a blade. "If she isn't dead, then where is she?" The morning after the teacup's strange return, Miss Marple made her way to Dr. Haydock's surgery. The vicar's wife had mentioned seeing him late at the hall, whispering with Colonel Bantry, avoiding the eyes of the villagers. Haydock looked weary when she arrived. He rose from his chair, his voice carefully measured. "Miss Marple, I am quite pressed with patience." "Of course," she said gently, "but you were the last to see Mrs. Bantry alive. I thought perhaps you could reassure me." His eyes flickered. Alive. The word had struck a chord. "She was gravely ill," he said quickly. "I examined her myself. Collapse, weakness, the signs were clear. And yet," Miss Marple murmured, "no one viewed her body before the funeral. That was your advice, was it not?" Haydock's hand tightened around his pen. "Dignity must be preserved, Miss Marple. I will not have the village gawking." She studied him. Calm, soft, relentless. "Dignity or secrecy?" His face hardened. "You doubt me?" She did not answer directly. Instead, her eyes fell to a paper on his desk, his account ledger. Payments noted, dates aligned. One entry in particular caught her eye. A substantial sum paid by Veronica Denham only 2 days before Dolly Bantry's collapse. Haydock followed her gaze. He snatched the ledger shut. "That is private. My professional fees are not for discussion." Miss Marple's voice was still soft. "Professional fees, yes, but unusually high for a mere consultation." Haydock's face flushed. "I was discreet. That is all. Colonel Bantry wished. Arrangements. Difficult matters require tact. Arrangements," Miss Marple repeated, her tone mild but laced with steel. "A funeral arranged in haste, a body no one saw, and money that changed hands at just the right moment." He stepped back, anger sparking. "You will not insinuate I was bribed. I serve this village faithfully. For years I've borne their secrets more than you can imagine." She met his gaze evenly. "Yes, Doctor. Secrets. And secrets are costly, are they not?" The air thickened. The truth hovered close, but not yet within reach. Haydock's silence was louder than denial. Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag, preparing to leave. Her eyes swept once more across the room, the locked cabinet, the ledger, the faint smell of brandy in the air. At the door, she paused. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but sharp as a needle. "This was never about accounts or foxglove leaves. The matter is larger. The threads pull tighter." She looked back at him, her expression unreadable. "The web was wider than anyone imagined." Miss Marple returned to her cottage as dusk fell. Her knitting lay untouched on the side table. Instead, she spread out a row of notes, scraps of paper, and clippings. Details, others dismissed. She lined them up like puzzle pieces. First, the condolence card, posted before Dolly Bantry collapsed. Typed, deliberate, expensive paper. Not a mistake. A warning or a script. Second, the wreaths. 2, identical. Both signed in the same hand. Ordered before the funeral was even announced. Someone had prepared not for death's shock, but for its certainty. Third, the marmalade jar. Not poisoned by accident. Its surface carried residue, bitter, acrid, deadly. And yet, no one else had fallen ill. Dolly alone had taken it. A poison measured, planned, precise. Fourth, the forged accounts. Harriet's confession explained the money, but her clumsy admission did not explain the timing. Why rewrite the ledgers in the dead of night unless a larger stage was being set? The ledgers were not the root they were, cover. Fifth, the garden disturbance. Colonel Bantry had mentioned it in passing footprints near the side gate. James had found the gravel raked smooth the next morning, as if someone wished to erase their steps. Yet the tracks had led not away from the hall, but toward it. And finally, the teacup, gone, then returned, scrubbed clean. A deliberate act, not of guilt, but of control. She leaned back in her chair, eyes closed, knitting needles resting across her palms. Her mind ran over the sequence. Too neat, too orderly. Every piece sliding into place not as events of chance, but as cues in a performance. The card before the collapse, the wreaths before the funeral, the sealed casket, the hasty service, the vague doctor's words. Even Harriet's confession handed over too easily, like a line spoken on cue. The villagers thought it done. Inspector Slack thought it finished. But Miss Marple knew better. Her lips moved, barely more than a breath. Accidents are messy. Crimes, when hurried, leave ragged edges. But here, everything is smooth, too smooth, as though someone rehearsed it. The cottage was quiet. Only the clock ticked, steady as a heartbeat. Outside, an owl called once, then fell silent. She gathered her papers, folded them neatly, and slipped them back into her knitting bag. Her face was calm, but her eyes shone with certainty now. Not accident, not impulse, but design. A stage had been set, a performance had been given, and every detail had been placed with precision. Her voice, soft but unwavering, filled the empty room. Someone rehearsed this crime like a play. It was Colonel Bantry who summoned them, though the idea was not his own. Miss Marple had suggested it quietly, gently, with that persuasive certainty no one ever quite resisted. And so, on a damp evening, the drawing-room at Gossington Hall filled once more. The Colonel sat stiffly by the fire, his grief plain but his posture unbent. Veronica Denham lounged nearby, elegant in her black silk, her eyes flashing with nervous energy. Harriet Pike sat bolt upright, portfolio clutched tight, jaw clenched, as if braced for attack. James stood near the door, pale and stiff, hands folded before him. Inspector Slack prowled the edge of the room, notebook ready, impatience etched in every line of his face. and at the centre, in her armchair, knitting set aside, sat Miss Marple. Small, quiet, unassuming, yet the room revolved around her. She began softly, her voice even, measured. We have been quick to accept appearances, quicker still to accept confessions. But appearances deceive, and confessions may serve as shields. No one spoke. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantel ticked. Miss Marple's gaze rested first on Harriet. You admitted to fraud. That much is true. You tampered with accounts, and Dolly Bantry discovered it. But your poisoning your foxglove was not the crime we thought. Harriet stiffened. I told you I only meant— Yes, Miss Marple interrupted gently. You only meant to silence her for a time. And you did, but her collapse was no more than the first act. She turned to James. You were seen lingering by the sideboard. You feared suspicion. But your loyalty to this house runs too deep. You hid nothing. You only feared losing trust. James bowed his head. My lady always trusted me. I would never harm her. Veronica shifted in her chair, bracelets clinking. And yet, harm was done, not by Harriet, not by James, but by someone who needed Dolly's disappearance more than anyone here. Miss Marple's eyes fixed on her. Ah, Veronica, you bring us closer. Money, position, influence, they swirl about you like perfume. And yet, your timing has always been impeccable. Arriving from London just before the collapse, ordering flowers before the funeral was even set. Veronica's lips parted, then closed, her hands tightened on her handkerchief. The room grew heavy with silence. Slack leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Out with it, Miss Marple. Enough riddles. Her knitting needles clicked once against each other, then fell still. Her eyes swept the room, Harriet's rigid fear, James's quiet loyalty, Veronica's thinly veiled nerves, the Colonel's grief. She spoke softly, but every word struck the air like a hammer. And one of you knows why Dolly Bantry had to disappear. No one moved. The fire cracked. Rain tapped the panes. Miss Marple spoke first. Let us put the acts in order. She held up one finger. A condolence card. Posted before the collapse. Not a mistake. A cue. A second finger. 2 wreaths. Ordered early. Both cards in the same hand. A third finger. A sealed coffin. A funeral arranged at speed. No viewing. Only vague phrases. Dignity. Delicate circumstances. A fourth. The teacup. Removed after the collapse. Returned later. Scrubbed clean. Inspector Slack folded his arms. Meaning? Miss Marple turned to Veronica. Meaning, my dear, the scene was staged, and staged by someone who lives by timing and appearances. Veronica laughed too bright. How theatrical, Aunt Jane. Miss Marple's eyes didn't blink. The florist remembered you. The order came from your hand, twice. She showed me a previous note you sent her last spring. Same loops, same slant, same flourish on the R in regret. Veronica's smile thinned. Flowers are hardly murder. No, Miss Marple agreed. Flowers are preparation. The card was preparation. The teacup's return control. And the payment to Dr. Haydock 2 days before the collapse arrangements. All eyes swung to the doctor. He stiffened. I certified what I saw. You certified what you were told to present, Miss Marple said softly. A collapse induced, not fatal. A removal arranged, not a body laid out. A coffin sealed, not proved. Colonel Bantry's face drained. Are you saying? Miss Marple's voice gentled. I am saying Dolly was made to disappear. Not murdered in that room. Removed. Hidden. Veronica surged to her feet. Absurd. Why would I? Motive, Miss Marple said, and the word cut clean. Debt. Reputation. A little matter in London that required cash and silence. Dolly knew. She meant to stop your access to the Colonel's generosity and to expose certain loans that never returned. Harriet's fraud gave you cover. You nudged her panic. You let her think a small sickness would keep Dolly from the committee. But you needed more than silence. You needed Dolly gone. Harriet stared, stricken. You used me. Veronica's eyes flashed. I did nothing of... Miss Marple lifted the black-edged card. Typed in London, on a machine with a warnie, the same warnie that appears in your note to the florist. You posted it the day you arrived. Because the collapse had a schedule. Slack snapped his notebook shut. That payment, Doctor. Haydock's voice was low. She pressed me. Said it was for nursing care. A private convalescent place by the ridge. 1 night only. I kept it discreet. Colonel Bantry gripped the chair back. Where is my wife? Haydock swallowed. A cottage beyond Little Ridley, under another name. I was to say nothing. I feared scandal. Veronica moved, a quick dart toward the door. Slack stepped across her path. Not tonight. Her poise shattered. I never meant to kill her, only to move her, to buy time, to keep everything from collapsing on me. Miss Marple's voice was almost kind. You rehearsed it well, child. The card, the wreaths, the sealed box, even the village chorus. Veronica's shoulders sagged, tears pricked, rage behind them. What did I forget, then? If you're so clever, what did I forget? Miss Marple's gaze rested on the clean teacup, then rose, steady as a verdict. She planned the perfect crime, but forgot one thing. By the week's end, the storm had broken. Veronica Denham was taken away under Inspector Slack's watch. Colonel Bantry, though shaken, had his wife returned to him, weak, pale, but alive. The truth, bitter as foxglove, had finally surfaced. And Street Mary Mead, so quick to chatter, began to quiet again. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price shook her head as she weighed sugar. Imagine. Poor Dolly hidden away, all for appearances, and Veronica always so charming. Never trust a pretty smile. Mr. Sims muttered. Harriet guilty of fraud. Yes, but not murder. And yet the village nearly hanged her for it. Shows how quick we are to judge. At the post office, talk turned back to stamps and parcels. At the churchyard, women spoke of lilies for Sunday, not wreaths for funerals. Slowly, suspicion slipped back into ordinary life. Colonel Bantry walked again in his garden, his step heavier, his eyes older. But his hand never left Dolly's as she rested beside him on the bench. She had been bruised by the ordeal, but her spirit remained fierce. I'll never eat marmalade again, she declared firmly, though her smile carried its old spark. Inspector Slack, grumbling as always, paid Miss Marple a reluctant visit. You had the right of it. I'll grant you that, though I don't know how you saw it from a few cards and a jar of jam. Miss Marple only smiled, her needles clicking softly. Patterns, Inspector. People rehearse their lies as carefully as they rehearse their crimes, but they always forget one stitch in the row. He harumphed, tugged at his collar, and left without another word. That evening, the village was quiet. The church bell rang softly, the cottages glowed with lamplight, and the air smelled of wood smoke. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting folded neatly in her lap. Her gaze lingered on the fading garden, the roses nodding in the twilight. The village would gossip again. It always did. Scandal one week, christenings the next, harvest suppers after that. Life folded over its own secrets like patchwork. But in the quiet, her thoughts remained with Dolly. A woman nearly erased, not by death, but by deception. All for greed, all for appearances, all for a reputation built on lies. Miss Marple sighed, her voice barely above a whisper. The trouble with secrets is they never stay buried. The clock chimed the hour. She reached for her needles again. Another row, another pattern, as endless as human folly, and the village, lulled once more into calm, did not see her eyes still sharp, still watchful, ready for the next thread of deceit to unravel. And so, dear friends, our mystery draws to its close. Dolly Bantry thought lost was never gone at all. Veronica's careful stage play unravelled, thread by thread, until the truth stood plain. It was never poison alone. It was preparation, performance, the rehearsal of a crime that might have fooled us all. But as Miss Marple reminded us, mistakes reveal more than truths. A condolence card too soon, a wreath ordered twice, a cup returned when it should have been gone forever. Small things, overlooked by many, but not by her. And now, order returns to Street Mary Mead. The gossip fades. The village rests easy once again. But we know, don't we, that secrets never truly sleep. They wait. They whisper. And when they rise, Miss Marple will be there quiet, sharp, ready. Thank you for listening tonight, and for joining us in another journey through lies, appearances, and the frailty of human nature. I wonder, friends, who did you suspect? Share your thoughts in the comments. I love to read them all. And tomorrow, another mystery awaits. A locked room, a vanished guest, and a truth more curious than ever. So, if you enjoyed tonight's tale, don't forget, subscribe now for more daily cases, because in this village, and in every village, mysteries are never far away. Good night, until the next story.